May the odds be ever in your favor. Hunger Games is a post-apocalyptic young adult novel that was published on October 14th of 2008 by author Suzanne Collins. This book has been met with a large amount of critical acclaim over the years. It's kind of shocking when you think that it's been out for about 15 years now, winning so many awards that I am not even going to try to list even a portion of them here. Yeah, it's a lot, guys. Yeah, I'd be here all day if I tried to read this list. However, other notable facts about this book I can do, like the fact that it has 2 sequels. The immediate sequel, which is Catching Fire, and the cap of the trilogy, Mockingjay. And I've read the entire series. I probably have opinions very much accurate to the common one. But to move on, it also received a prequel called The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes that was published last year, I believe. The series, sans the prequel, at least for the moment, all received movie adaptations, starting with, of course, the first one on November 22nd, 2013. Supposedly, the prequel will get a movie adaptation that's going to come out this year, 2023 being the year I'm filming this. But I'll see it when I believe it, since I've seen no trailers for it or even hype behind it, even though the movie will be coming out supposedly on November 17th. Apart from that, there isn't too much to say about this book. You could credit it for the kicking off the main YA dystopia trend that was crazy back when I was in high school, so, during the 2010s. But I guess that's more speculation than anything. I would definitely credit it personally, because I can remember the number of Hunger Game clones I read as a kid. But anyways, to not get too wrapped up in the minor details, I will just move on to the report card. I actually think that's more reviews than Da Vinci Code got, and that was like one of my main things that got a lot of reviews, so it's kind of fun. But honestly, Hunger Games is one of those books that I read while it was really getting popular. I remember picking it up and reading through it, and while I was reading through it, I think somewhere near the end, about at least over halfway through, that's about the time Catching Fire came out. And I had to wait a couple weeks after finishing this to actually get it from the high school library that I was taking it from, because, it was a new book that was out. It also, I think, was my first real YA dystopia book, but considering it was 15 years ago when I read this, or at least 12, like a minimum of 13. The point is, it's been over a decade when I first read this, so I wouldn't trust my entirely reliable memory to state that as a fact, for sure. But when I read it, I remember absolutely loving this book. It was a fun read. It had a great main character. It had a nuance that, although I didn't really appreciate as much as I do now, I still understood was making the story better. This is one of those books that I do actually remember sitting in the library during lunchtime and just reading at one of the tables trying to finish it because I enjoyed it that much. I was that kid, by the way. I was the kid in high school who would just go into the library, or actually middle school too. Just go in the library and read for the most part. Eventually I did just start hanging out with my friends, but that's not what you're here to hear about. But anyways, because of that, you could say that I have a fair amount of nostalgic love for this series, and a fair amount of experience, considering I've read them all and I saw all the adaptions. However, I haven't read it in some time, as after reading Mockingjay, a book I didn't very much like at the time I read it, I kind of dropped the series for a while, as opposed to other favorite childhood classics of mine, like Harry Potter, before, J.K. Rowling did that, started being herself, I guess, and Percy Jackson, which I would revisit like every year or two and just reread the series for old time's sake. I haven't actually read Hunger Games for at least 5 years, maybe longer, because of that. So I thought this would make it a perfect book to revisit for my nostalgic reevaluation month. Ruin childhood classics of mine, because, why have nostalgic? Anyways, I'm kidding. But let's move on. Before I get into my review, let's do what we typically talk about. First is the cover. And unfortunately, for those of you who do like my cover section, I'm not going to go too deep into it because, once more, this is one of those books that, even if the cover wasn't good at the time it came out, which I don't agree with, mind you, completely detached from what I'm about to say, is this cover is actually a pretty decent one. But this is a cover that has become so popular and famous that just seeing it immediately brings to mind Hunger Games. This is a cover that earned its place in your memory, even if it wasn't a cover that may have been great at the time. That being said, I do still think it's great because you have the Mockingjay pin, you have the black background hinting at, the sort of darkness in the book. You have the arrow in the Mockingjay's mouth and through the Hunger Games right here, hinting at Katniss's archery skills. It's all very good. It's like even here, up here, the Hunger Games, that silver glossy Hunger Games has a shadow or I'll say an outline. An outline that is just barely blood red. So you get what's gonna happen in here. It hints at that. Beneath all the shininess, this really is just a blood sport. It's all very good. So, gushing aside, let's just move on. The synopsis. If you're one of those rare people who hasn't heard the Hunger Games synopsis, first of all, I want to ask you how, even if you haven't read the Hunger Games or watched any of the movies, the concept of the Hunger Games itself has become so synonymous with so many things. It's literally become its own genre, battle royale, although obviously that can be attributed to the thing that a lot of people talk about that it may have stolen from. I've read both, and I disagree with that statement, but anyways, the point being, you're at least familiar with the basic concept. However, if you're interested in seeing how the story presents itself on a synopsis basis, I recommend checking out my TBR. And for the context of this review, here's a quick synopsis read, or a quick synopsis of my own. Basically, we're in a distant future where after a massive war, North America reinvented itself as Panem, a collection of 13 districts and the main district, the capital. However, the capital was a tyrannical government, so at one point these 13 districts attempted to rebel against the capital, and they were promptly squashed, at least according to the capital's version of the events. District 13 was completely destroyed, and the remaining 12 districts, to forever punish them for their attempt to rebel against the capital, were forced to undergo the Hunger Games. Now, these Hunger Games require every district to send one male tribute and one female tribute to the capital every year to take place in a blood sport where their children will fight to the death. These tributes have to be between the ages of 12 to 17, and watching the Hunger Games is mandatory. This year's Hunger Games, we follow Katniss Everdeen, a young woman who volunteers for her 12-year-old sister Primrose after she is chosen, and soon finds herself not just being a tribute who is doomed for the arena, but having a potential to actually win this, and maybe even accidentally becoming something more in the eyes of many people of Panem. But, to move on, let's get on to the review. Truth be told, this book still holds up really well for me. It's still a rather decent read, and with my experience of reading, I can definitely say that there were aspects of this book that when I initially read it, I didn't appreciate as much as I did on this reread I just did. Now, that's not to say that there weren't some faults that brought it down as I went on in age. One such thing is that the book is shockingly fast. I remember the book being much longer, but at the same time I was a more inexperienced reader. But it sort of like I was blitzing through this book at points. Things that I remember being chapters apart were actually in the same chapter, to the point I was like, I feel like you're doing too much too fast. You know what I mean? It only took me about 2 or 3 days to read, and when my average read involves stuff like The Foreigner and Invader these days, where this is what the average page looks like, I blame that more just as my reading preferences that have evolved over the time. But again, that being said, there were still a lot of parts of this book that I deeply enjoyed on a reread that I don't think I appreciated as much on, on my first reading. For example, I understood a fair amount of the deeper themes and the symbolisms that were presented. For example, Rues Death. In my first reading of this book, I remember Rues Death being a sad, tragic event, and I definitely remember picking up on it as showing that this is what the games really do, that these are children dying. This isn't a sport. This isn't something you should be enjoying. This Rue is a tragic character of circumstance, and she's a little girl who never got to live her life because of this game. However, one of the things that I didn't quite understand at that time was why Rues Death in specific was such a powder keg compared to everything else. It's been 74 years, and no doubt they've seen plenty of very young children die. So why did Rue specifically cause something out? Well, reading through this again, I realized something. That was because when Katniss decorated her body with the flowers, sang to her as she was dying, it reminded everyone who was watching back home that Rue was a little girl, that she was human, that these aren't characters on a screen, that these aren't boards that these aren't pieces you sacrifice for safety. These are children. It's actually one of the things that I think the adaptation did really well, is that after Rue's death, we see the immediate fallout of what Katniss did, because it helps put into perspective a little more just how severe Katniss's actions really were. It also puts into perspective some of the changes they make later on, like when they pretend that they're going to let the two people from the same district go home if they went together, to try and quell some of the rioting going on. By the way, personal headcanon, this scene in the movie, my personal headcanon for it is that's Rue's father or an older brother who started the riots. And that was his breaking point when he came to think to himself, I don't have anything left to lose. And that's why he starts the riot and the ultimate rebellion. I just think it's a very nice thing. Also, yes, believe it or not, I actually did pick up on the not too subtle allegory that the two tributes from the agricultural district that are treated like slaves are dark-skinned. That I did pick that up as a kid. It's just, I kind of remember reading it now. I'm like, wow, that's not subtle at all. At all. It's not a bad thing. I'm just saying, I should not have been proud as a kid to be like, oh wow, I totally see the correlation here. Like, yeah, I'd have to be blind not to. But I also deeply appreciated the underlying theme in this book about the class warfare and how the rich will ultimately treat the people they think as beneath them, i.e. the poor, as simply objects for their own amusement. The capital are all the rich people. The poor people are constantly suffering, constantly struggling to even eke by, and the only chance they have of becoming at least middle class is to appease a rich person enough that they get to live. But yeah, so I considering our today's volatile, landscape involving that, I'm just saying we're like one step away from reenacting the French Revolution. It's just it does hold up. You really do appreciate it nowadays. I actually think it's more relevant today than it was back then. Not to say this problem didn't exist back then, it's just we didn't do anything about it. Anyways, so overall, I would say this is one of those books that really did hold up to a reread, and I would give it an 8 out of 10. Yeah, it really does hold up. I mean, the book itself, if you haven't read it in a while, I would recommend going to read it. I'm not going to lie, it is a bit simplistic nowadays. I think an older reader is going to have the same issue I had, like, where I was just basically like, oh my god, why is this going so fast? And I don't mean that in the sense that I was just so enraptured with what was happening. I mean that more in the sense that it's just a really simplistic writing. There's also a couple things here and there that you kind of just got to accept. There are definitely creative liberties with certain things. Nothing too much, nothing too immersion breaking, but you do notice them when you're actually looking for them. But it's a good book and definitely holds up to the 15 years that it's been out. I actually, like I said, I would actually argue it's a little more relevant today than when it first was published. With that being said, Obviously, it doesn't deserve Mount Doom. This is a book that deserves to be on my that deserves to stay on the shelf, and you know what? Maybe I will reread it every now and then. I might even reread the sequels to see if maybe I appreciate them a little more rather than the initial impressions I have, because I don't remember liking Catching Fire that much. It was much more of a political drama, and I've already stated before that political dramas aren't too great in my opinion, or at least too great for me. And Mockingjay, well, I'm pretty sure I'm not going to like Mockingjay on a reread, mostly because I didn't like the ending at all, but I'll give it another chance, is what I'm saying. But with that, we'll move on. Hunger Games, you've earned your spot. But what book is next? What will I read that comes? I mean, it's got to be... I just read something about a bunch of people being stuck in an arena killing themselves. I really got to look out. The next book is Promising Some Dangerous Days. I really hope Daniel X will help me out. But until then, remember, with every book comes an adventure, and every adventure is worth having, even the bad ones.